Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, May 2nd. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times news organization. He has led a number of successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all you do at the Washington Times Foundation. Very excited about our program today. We're going to take a look at the address of President Yoon, the President of the Republic of Korea, to the joint session of Congress. It was a wonderful example of partnership and alliance between the U.S. and Korea, and very, very touching to remember the sacrifices of both Korean and U.S. veterans. And also the alliance has shown that that partnership for democracy and peace has brought great prosperity to Korea so that they can be a partner together with the democracies such as America and other parts of the world that are able to advance technology tremendously. So I think our program will be most interesting. Our special guest speaker today is Mr. Guy Taylor, who's the National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times. He's an award-winning correspondent and oversees covering all issues with the State Department, the Pentagon, and also Intel throughout not only Northeast Asia, but throughout the Middle East and the rest of the world. Guy was engaged in extensive international reporting for the last 20 years in Latin America and throughout the Asia Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of U.S. policy towards North Korea crisis has won accolades from across the political spectrum. He's won awards also for journalism from the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for the distinguished reporting on the presidency. We really are happy that he's our special guest today. Our panelist is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Our moderator, who has been really guiding these programs with great skill, is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. He's a commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was special envoy for negotiations with North Korea, the director of National Counterproliferation Center, and the associate director of national intelligence. Welcome to Ambassador DeTrani.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. It's an honor being here. And what a great opportunity to sit down with Guy Taylor and Dr. Mansourov and talk about the visit, the very successful visit of President Yoon Suk-yeol. What a great occasion. You mentioned, Michael, let me just sort of set the scene here. You mentioned the joint session with Congress and how well that was received by both sides of the aisle. But let me just start with the beginning of the trip, the visit to Arlington Cemetery to commemorate the 70 years of this very special alliance. The Korean War that ended on the 27th of July, 1953, we had over 37,000 Americans killed, over 100,000 wounded, over 1 million South Koreans killed and wounded. This relationship is forged in that Korean War, and the heroes who served to preserve freedom in the Republic of Korea. And as we look at what's going on in North Korea, we see a North Korea now that has gone beyond the pale. A North Korea that just launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, a Hwasong-18, solid fueled. A message very clearly to the United States that we in Pyongyang in North Korea can target the United States, anywhere in the United States, very much so. And what they're doing with the building of additional nuclear weapons intercontinental ballistic missiles I mentioned, short range, medium range ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, submarine launch ballistic missiles. North Korea has just gone beyond the pale. But fortunately, we have this unique alliance with the Republic of Korea. And what came out of this visit, this very important visit, very successful state visit, was a Washington declaration that made it very clear to North Korea, to China, and to all countries that extended deterrence on the part of the United States is a commitment we have to the Republic of Korea. The Washington Declaration, the visits of nuclear-armed submarines to ports in South Korea, the introduction of bombers and other strategic assets to the Republic of Korea. This is important. And the response from the Republic of Korea was welcoming this and saying they will cease and desist and not pursue their own nuclear weapons capability, which is extremely important. So this is such an important occasion. But let me mention also, Dr. Jenkins, and I'll end on this note, you mentioned the joint session yesterday, a very outstanding presentation by President Yoon. But he also, in that very comprehensive statement, talked about the human rights situation in North Korea. We're hearing more about the human rights situation in North Korea, which is so correct, because over 40% of the population is malnourished. We saw in the 1990s over 1 million people in the arduous march dying of starvation. And we're looking at the possibility of food scarcity again, and the potential for great starvation in North Korea. So all these issues are going to be discussed today, and we're so fortunate to have Guy Taylor. I think this is one man who really understands the peninsula, understands what's happening in North Korea and the dynamics in South Korea, but the whole of East Asia. He recently visited Taiwan. He knows what's going on the Taiwan Strait, the Indo-Pacific region. So we're so fortunate. So over to you, Guy Taylor.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you, Ambassador DeTrani, and also Dr. Alex Mansourov, and especially to Larry Moffat and Dr. Michael Jenkins and the Washington Times Foundation. It's really an honor as a journalist in the Washington Times newsroom, covering global security matters, having closely covered Northeast Asia and the consequential security dynamics there over the past 15 years or so. It's an honor to be with the Washington Brief to share my perspective, because I actually often report on the discussions that occur right here in this forum. My articles summarizing those discussions appear in the Washington Times. So for me, it's an honor to follow people like former National Security Council Director for China, Dennis Wilder. He was here last month, or Ken DeCleva, an amazing researcher, probably the highest level psychological profiler of not only Kim Jong-un, but Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. You know, a couple of months ago, Marcus Gerlauskas was here, so many others, Allison Hooker, the list goes on. So it's special for me to be able to bring a sort of different perspective, that of a journalist whose role is multifold. On one hand, journalists, the job is to ask a lot of questions and smart questions. So I'm going to raise a bunch of them here. On the other hand, a national security journalist's role is to digest and try to boil down some of the complex security issues into simpler concepts for the broader audience to understand. And so, most importantly, the timing of our discussion a few days after President Yoon's historic, and I would say based on covering South Korean leader visits to Washington of the recent past, Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in, this was really a historic visit by President Yoon to the United States. I want to try to summarize it myself and just add to what Joe put out here so far. You know, this was a really carefully timed visit by the South Koreans and the Biden administration, not so much as a reaction to geopolitical developments, North Korean provocations, China's increasing aggression toward Taiwan, the Ukraine war, but really carefully timed more as a historic messaging and momentum building celebration of the 70th anniversary of the US-ROK alliance, and all the meaning and important optics for the free world that this specific alliance carries with it, which which will culminate over the coming months with various events. Ultimately, we've got July, but then on October 1, the actual anniversary of the 1953 signing of the US-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty. A quick note of context and history, there's another treaty. It's actually 8 years, the US-ROK Treaty is actually 8 years older than another mutual defense treaty in the region, one that doesn't get much attention despite having increasingly sensitive relevance in the 21st century. It was July 1961 that China and North Korea actually inked their mutual defense treaty, a treaty notably that Pyongyang and Beijing have re-upped multiple times over the decades, most recently in 2021, amid growing North Korean provocations that followed the stall in Trump-era denuclearization summits with Kim Jong-un. Anyway, a few important top-line takeaways on President Yoon's visit. The first big one from an American perspective is the truly politically unifying tone of the visit. Something that very few international leaders could do or pull off at this moment in US politics, a moment that's so often characterized in American and the world's media of one of division. This sort of trope that Washington is so divided, that America is so divided politically, that Republicans and Democrats so hate each other that they can't agree on anything. The most amazing aspect of the Yoon state visit was the way that President Yoon brought the two American parties together in unity. Both Republicans and Democrats pretty much universally and totally support the US-ROK alliance, and admiration for South Korea as an innovative, economic, cultural powerhouse, and a politically diverse, successful democracy is deep in the hearts of any American politician who pays any attention, regardless of their ideological leanings. And I think that President Yoon capitalized on that, especially with some nuanced lines in his address to Congress last Thursday, but also in the slate of meetings with stakeholders from both sides of the aisle around Washington all last week. And then by being really personable and just humble and funny and likable and really like magically charismatic in visiting the Biden White House, a White House that gets a lot of criticism, by the way, for fumbling, frankly, on North Korea policy over the past 3 years. Remember, it's a difficult and unique aspect of great democracies like the ROK and the United States that, unlike their autocratic rivals, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, whose leaders seize and hold power for decades or life, power and heads of state in representative democracies change hands every few years, and it can be a challenge. We had Moon Jae-in, a liberal human rights lawyer, largely a promoter of sunshine appeasement toward North Korea. He was in power in Seoul at a time when we had a hawkish Republican president in Washington with former President Trump. Somehow they worked very closely and well together. And now jump ahead just a few years and we have President Yoon, very different from President Moon. Yoon is a hawkish conservative in power in Seoul, and he's working, I'd say, overall very well with the liberal, soft touch diplomacy, non-aggressive posturing of President Biden, now in power in Washington. So the fact that President Yoon operated so comfortably with Biden, I mean, consider, there's video out there of him singing Don McLean's iconic song, American Pie, at the state dinner with Biden, standing beside him. I can still remember how the music used to make me smile. The point here is that President Yoon showed, and I would argue the same way that former president actually showed in his interactions with Moon Jae-in, that the alliance is so deep that it supersedes the difficult and evolving representative power structures inherent to democracies. And it also shows how that evolving power structure issue can be a strategic strength and an asset, because you have to imagine the ideological monolithic Chinese Communist Party or the authoritarian Kim regime or Putin trying to figure out the deep unity that was on display there among really ideologically different leaders in Biden and Yoon, whose governments are constantly being targeted by efforts from autocratic rivals that want to divide them by seizing on the appearance of disagreements between them. So unifying, that was really an important aspect and tone of the Yoon visit, and it shouldn't be understated. A second major top line was that this visit wasn't totally about just glad handing or sort of theatrical backslapping. Some major strategic stuff actually got signed and agreed upon in Washington last week. First and foremost, the Washington Declaration. Joe already summarized it, but in a nutshell, the U.S. agreed to formally give South Korea a central role for the first time in any strategic planning or moves toward the potential use of nuclear weapons in any conflict with North Korea. Washington and Seoul agreed to establish a nuclear consultative group for really unprecedentedly enhanced intelligence and information sharing on nuclear and strategic weapons operations plans. And very importantly, the South Korean side, in exchange for the US commitment to create this body, Seoul pretty formally declared that South Korea will not pursue its own nuclear weapons arsenal. This is a big deal. And we're all, I think, trying to really unpack the potentially historic meaning of this going forward. You know, was this something that President Yoon really pushed for? Was it something that the Biden administration pushed for? Is there actually U.S. intelligence community consensus around this? And what are the strategic and geopolitical implications of it? Was this the Biden administration's way of responding to a slate of nuclear weapons-related provocations by Kim Jong-un over the past 2 years? Among them, Pyongyang's enshrinement last September of a new law claiming North Korea has the right to use preemptive nuclear strikes to protect itself. We've also heard increased vows by Kim Jong-un that North Korea is now more than ever determined to expand its nuclear warhead and ICBM arsenal, including the Hwasong-18 massive ICBM, claiming to have tested it actually. And then in March, we saw the first ever photo circulating through North Korean state media purporting to show an arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons that Pyongyang claims to have now in its arsenal. So President Biden has been under pressure to respond to these provocations. And I think we have to ask, was this Washington Declaration that response? And if so, is it the right response? How exactly is this going to result in enhanced deterrence against the North Korean nuclear threat and not backfire in a way that leads to more escalation? That's something I definitely want to hear the perspectives of Ambassador DeTrani and Dr. Mansourov on. And probably, the most important detail to note about the declaration is it states outright that the U.S. Will enhance regular visibility of strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula, as evidenced by the upcoming visit of a U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarine to the ROK. This is actually going to be the first time in literally decades that the U.S. has docked a nuclear-armed sub on the peninsula. Is this preemptive or is it reactive? And if it is preemptive, is it truly about preempting North Korean provocations, such as a much anticipated 7th DPRK nuclear weapon test, or is it about preemption and deterrence vis-a-vis China and its own expanding nuclear weapons activities? Another key point, while the actual wording of the Washington Declaration was a little bit curtailed or vague, a separate fact sheet put out by the White House last week used really lucid language, saying the U.S. is particularly committed to enhancing the deployment of nuclear-capable platforms in and around the Korean Peninsula. So that language went further than the Washington Declaration itself, and I hope we can discuss that. At the same time, I think we really need to try and unpack how this Washington Declaration relates to or impacts the wider strategic calculus beyond North Korea, looking more squarely at China and Russia, both of whom have reacted pretty harshly to it so far. How will the movement of nuclear-armed U.S. submarines around the Korean Peninsula impact China's posture toward Taiwan? How will Beijing and Moscow view this commitment by the Yoon administration that South Korea will not pursue its own nuclear arsenal? Does the Chinese Communist Party leadership see that as perhaps a victory for China? One can easily make the argument that it may, especially if we consider the likelihood that Beijing could be deeply threatened if South Korea were to have not made this commitment. The notion that a close mutual defense treaty ally of the United States that's already housing 30,000 American troops and the largest US military base overseas with Camp Humphreys would itself be openly or clandestinely pursuing a nuclear arsenal, I think we could pretty firmly agree that China does not want that. But of course, these things are debatable, as are the impacts that this declaration will have on the security dynamics between South Korea and Japan, which is itself flirting, if that's the right word, with the hypothetical prospect of jumping into a post-pacifist nuclear arms race. So, there's a lot to unpack. Let's look quickly at a couple of other things, affirmations that got highlighted in the wider joint statements from the Yoon and Biden governments. It's notable that the two affirmed that the US and ROK are committed to deepening economic, commercial, environmental cooperation. Part of this affirmation centered on increasing cooperation on semiconductor development and manufacturing, electric vehicles, batteries, biotechnology, clean energy, and so on. There was a broad statement of an intention to pursue cooperation in the futuristic world of quantum information science and technology, QUIST, quantum computing, which is kind of the catchphrase for the future of artificial intelligence. I think if we're examining any pitfalls or weaker points in the Yoon visit and the overall relationship, one would be that there were not many specific details on the actual parameters of this increased cooperation on technology development and trade. A looming issue facing the alliance right now, away from the North Korea threat, is the economic competition that's playing out between the US and China, and within it, a kind of competition for the very valuable trade and manufacturing supply line friendship and partnership of South Korea. This competition is rearing its head right now on the advanced semiconductor or microchip manufacturing and design front. Consider that South Korea's #1 trade partner overall last year was not the United States, it was China. Excuse me. And when we're talking about export sales of South Korean goods, automobiles, televisions, smart refrigerators, non-Apple smartphones, the things that South Korea's most known global brands, I'm talking Samsung, Kia, LG Electronics, Hyundai Motor, China outstrips the US as an export destination for those brands by a pretty solid margin. China's market is buying about 156 billion worth of South Korean exports annually. Well, the US is buying about 110 billion. Of course, things get a bit more complicated if we consider that the US, as well as Japan actually, are dramatically outstripping China on foreign direct investment into South Korea. In 2019, the US and Japan together accounted for more than 40% of total FDI going into South Korean companies. That's compared to China, which accounted for only about 4%. So that's sort of a window into the complexity of this economic competition between the US and China vis-a-vis South Korea. We could call it an entanglement that South Korea is really right in the middle of. And the reason I'm going into this so much is because semiconductors are arguably the most valuable exports that South Korea has right now. Last year alone, South Korea exported about $129 billion worth of computer chips. That's like 20% of all South Korean exports. And China is not only the leading customer, it's also inside China that some South Korean firms supply chain source a lot of the raw materials used in microchips and actually do a lot of fabricating of the components of the chips. So this is sensitive in the US-ROK alliance because the Biden administration has begun over the past couple of years, amid rising US-China geopolitical friction, to pretty openly push on allies around the world to decouple from China in the chip sector, and specifically to agree not to sell China the most advanced microchips, artificial intelligence level chips that could be used in developing dominant weapons and military technology, for instance, as well as the manufacturing technology used to actually fabricate those chips. So while there were these broad statements during the Yoon visit affirming the US-South Korean coordination on semiconductor development issues in this sort of futuristic quantum computing developments, there's a sense that this push for South Korea not to manufacture inside China, not to source everything from China, etc. This was one of the stickier behind the scenes discussions that went on between Korean and US officials last week, considering that President Yoon brought with him a relatively large delegation of high-level officials. And there was no evidence that the Biden administration offered anything like concessions for South Korean companies, specifically South Korean automakers who, like their European counterparts, are pretty frustrated right now that they cannot receive tax breaks and subsidies from President Biden's recent Inflation Reduction Act for electric vehicles, despite very hefty investments that those South Korean companies, automakers specifically, are putting into the US market right now, including a $5.4 billion electric vehicle plant that Hyundai Motor Group is currently building in Georgia, the state that is actually expected to generate something along the lines of 8,000 or more than 8,000 jobs for Americans. In the bigger picture, there's concern here that China is trying to geopolitically exploit the heavy trade relationship it has with South Korea. I think if we're analyzing how the overall Yoon visit was perceived by Beijing, we might again entertain the argument that since there was no really specific statement on semiconductors or South Korean acquiescence to US demands for tech sector divestiture in China, Beijing may view that as a win for China at a time when China is figuring out how can it most effectively exert the so-called economic instrument of power in precarious relationships, such as those involving trade partnerships with countries like South Korea that happen to be major security allies of the United States. Overall, we might say that the visit could have been an opportunity for Yoon and Biden to stand a little more firmly together to put out some kind of a trade and economic statement towards Beijing, and we didn't hear that. That being said, in wrapping up here, I do want to go back and just cap things off by reiterating this theme of unity that really anchored the Yoon visit, specifically the very rousing speech that President Yoon gave to Congress. He's the 7th South Korean president to have addressed Congress, but it's still a very rare thing for a world leader to have the chance to do that and then to actually do it effectively. And I would say that he very much did it effectively and to rousing, really inspiring bipartisan applause in the hallowed US congressional chamber. 3 top lines that jumped out at me in the speech were that President Yoon stated outright that, quote, we need to speed up US, Japan, South Korea cooperation. This is a consequential and important statement and development from where we were just a few years ago amid major diplomatic and economic friction and frustrating historical acrimony between Japan and South Korea. It's I think important to note that President Yoon specifically, he said, enhanced ROK Japan-US cooperation needs to occur in the context of countering, quote, the increasing North Korean nuclear threat. He did not mention China or Taiwan. He said at the same time he believes in keeping the door open for dialogue on North Korea's denuclearization. President Yoon said outright that Russia's war against Ukraine is, quote, a violation of international law, that Korea will stand in solidarity with the free world behind Ukraine. Notably, he steered clear of saying South Korea will bow to reported Biden administration pressure that Seoul provide weapons for Ukrainian forces, another sticky issue right now in the relationship. And on the semiconductor issue, excuse me, he said South Korea is committed to working, quote, to create, quote, stable and reliable supply chains. That was probably a bow to pressure from the Biden administration but Yoon did not actually mention China or South Korea's major semiconductor trade with China. What President Yoon did do, however, was articulate the risk facing democracy in the world overall right now. And he did so in a way that was frankly more robust and lucid than what we're used to hearing from the Biden administration at this point. While President Yoon did not mention China or Russia specifically, he alluded to the rise of influence that their autocratic and authoritarian media systems are having over the global information space. He said that in many parts of the world, false propaganda and disinformation are distorting truth and public opinion and threatening democracy. He also stressed that disinformation threatens intellectualism and the rule of law. And this drew rousing applause from US lawmakers. He also said we must work together and fight the forces of falsehood and deception that seek to destroy democracy in the world. This is the kind of inspirational messaging that the Biden administration and really any US administration, we can fairly say the former Trump administration as well, could learn a thing or two from when it comes to articulating the stakes of great power competition that the world finds itself in now between authoritarian autocracy and freedom-oriented democracies and free markets. You know, some 3 decades now after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the US-Soviet Cold War, a quarter of a century of the way into the 21st century. Finally, President Yoon said that South Korea will do what we can to protect freedom of humanity and will stand with the US in that mission into the future. So with that, I close out my wrap here. I'm very interested in hearing from Ambassador DeTrani, Dr. Mansourov, and I know there are probably some differences of opinions and questions and insights, and I hope we can dig into that.
No, this was a great presentation. As you said, is a speech, is a presentation to the joint session of Congress, free and open Indo-Pacific peace in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, this is what a powerful presentation. There's no question about it. Guy, there's so much to unpack with what you said. Over to you, Dr. Mansourov.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and greetings, everyone. And Guy, what a marvelous presentation. You just served us a delicious steak. And, but you know, I like it salted and peppered and with a little bit of garlic. So that's my job, to basically raise some questions with your delicacy. And no doubt, I mean, this was a historic visit by the South Korean president, which marked the 70th anniversary of our very successful alliance. And it took place despite some challenges and difficulties, which I'd like to highlight for a moment. I mean, Ambassador DeTrani gave us a historic context. Let me share a couple of observations about the domestic political context within which this visit was taking place. Both presidents, President Biden and Yoon, they have something in common, specifically very low popularity ratings, popular approval ratings. In South Korea, Yoon has less than 19% approval rating. The same here, slightly higher, President Biden. Number one. Number two, both presidents, I mean, they demonstrated willingness to prosecute their political opponents, essentially shutting out political opposition, putting it in jail or prosecuting. And even Politico the other day put out an article saying that the Biden administration can learn some tricks from the former prosecutor-in-chief, President Yoon, what to do with his political opponents. Now, also, these two presidents, they're well known as being one café a day presidents, as you know, and we saw some of that on display. Now, as you know, in the lead up to this visit, the South Korean government had to overhaul its national security team, replacing the national security advisor, foreign minister, ambassador in Washington, which suggested that clearly there were some difficulties which they had to go through to prepare that successful visit. And of course, a couple of very controversial statements which President Yoon made in the interview, that ill-famous interview to Reuters, one about Russia, another about China, kind of raised concerns. But that aside, the visit itself clearly was momentous. I think it was a tremendous success. It kind of put to rest all the questions, all the concerns, except the end result. And the end result, the Washington Declaration, a major accomplishment. And yet, as you guys probably heard, some observers began to speculate that maybe it did more, the Washington Declaration, to dissuade South Korea from going nuclear, basically to convince South Korea to reaffirm its commitment to the non-proliferation treaty, then rather than to deter North Korea from going, basically from going all the way, the full Monty with its WMD escapade. So that's the first question I would like you to comment on, whether indeed on balance, the declaration actually did more to make sure that South Korea does not violate its NPT commitments, as opposed to deterring actually North Korea from any more aggressive behavior. That's number one. And number two, a related question. I mean, you talked a lot about unity, and I agree with you that President Yoon basically kind of was one of those moments, his visit, which basically unified two political camps, two political parties in this country. And he did it through his speeches, through the meetings, his personal charisma, his personality, which was very liked everywhere in the White House, on the Capitol Hill. But that kind of left unnoticed what we see today in on the newswires and the newspapers, the emerging controversy over the so-called nuclear sharing, or the interpretation of what exactly was agreed to in that nuclear declaration. As you know, the senior director of for East Asia at the National Security Council, Edgar Kagan, said that no, the U.S. did not agree to nuclear sharing in these talks, whereas the principal deputy chairman of South Korean National Security Officer, Kim Dae-her, the man who did a lot to ensure the success of this visit, he said that the Washington Declaration made South Korean people now happy that from now on, the Republic of Korea will share nuclear weapons with the United States. So clearly, there is either misunderstanding or misinterpretation, or something is going on. And so if, as my second question, you could kindly please explain to us what that mandate of the Nuclear Consultative Group is really all about, and how does it square with the U.S. non-proliferation treaty obligations, if we really agreed to share nuclear weapons, as South Koreans believe, under the Washington Declaration. So those two questions, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansourov. Please, over to you, Guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So these are good and deep deep questions. I mean, did the declaration, does it do more to appease South Korea than to actually deter North Korea?
Yeah.
I don't think it will deter North Korea in the small game, meaning minor provocations that inch the North Korea's aggressive strategic posture forward. It may actually give the Kim government justification to carry out more incremental provocations, such as deploying or moving around its own nuclear armed submarines. But when we come to deterrence in the big picture, as a response to all of this rhetoric that has come out of the regime about nuclear weapons over the last year and a half, I think that that this will work as a key step in big picture deterrence, because it's really the first time since before the first nuclear crisis, the North Korean nuclear crisis, and we're going back decades now, right? Several, that the US has openly talked about putting strategic assets on the peninsula. I mean, we're talking about nuclear weapon armed vehicles that are going to be very closer than is publicly known to the threat emanating from North Korea. And that's, I don't see how that does anything other than send a really sobering message to the Kim government that, look, we don't like what you're doing, but we hear you. And I'll tell you what, if you want us to make moves, we're doing it. And we have a lot more strength than you on this. And this is just a little start. And I think in that respect, this could result in big picture deterrence. But I'm more concerned, I right now and in the coming weeks about the China dynamic with this, and China's reaction from, is this a justification for further escalation between the United States and China? And that's very hard to calculate. It's very hard to assess, because that escalation seems to happen, or years go by, and then we all look at it and say, wow, we're in a very different place than we were 5 years ago vis-a-vis military escalation between China and the United States. And so I don't think we know yet how the Washington Declaration will fit into that. As far as South Korea, the strategic standpoint for South Korea has to become this reliant on the United States, saying it will hold to the non-proliferation treaty. It won't develop its own arsenal, but South Korea puts itself further into a position of being closer to this very unique position of potential mediator in the great power competition between the US and China. So that to me is very interesting, because it's going on outside of the North Korea dynamic specifically. I think when we're looking at your second question here, if we're trying to analyze what did the Washington Declaration actually say, what is it actually? How deep will this consultative body go? What will it do? What the document actually said is the U.S. is sending nuclear assets to the peninsula, and a consultative body will be set up focused on the nuclear strategic posture, and that consultative body will have U.S. and South Korean officials on it. As for where this actually goes over the coming year or two or three or four, we will see. It may depend on who is in office in Seoul over the coming years and in Washington. And it will also depend on how China, North Korea, and Russia act, and what the sort of geopolitical movements and security dynamics are vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis China. So we really don't know. But if we're trying to pin it down, the reason that this is a big deal is because the statement, the declaration, actually calls for the creation. It calls for deployment, and then it calls for the creation of a body that, let's see who ends up working on that body. Let's see where this goes. I think that it's very interesting in that way.
So Guy, can I just jump in here? Thank you, Alexander, for the excellent questions. You really captured the whole spectrum of issues with North Korea. The Washington Declaration, the consultative group, nuclear consultative group, the introduction of obviously the nuclear armed submarines and the messages passing to North Korea. But I think many who've looked at North Korea over the years understands that North Korea, and certainly the Kim Jong-un regime, is not suicidal. And the extended deterrence has always been a part of the equation with North Korea. If you do something stupid, if you escalate or if you attack the Republic of Korea, the US will be there. And that's why we have over 28,000 troops as a tripwire in the Republic of Korea. So it's obvious. One of the issues that some people bring up, and maybe you could address this also, is that we're talking about reinforcing this extended deterrence, this commitment. And a lot of that is in response to the impetus in South Korea to build their own nuclear weapons. Over 70% of the population saying, well, you know, especially now that North Korea has intercontinental ballistic missiles that could target the US, maybe we need our own nuclear arsenal here to make it clear to North Korea that we will respond rather than just relying on the US, sort of to what we saw in the 60s with John F. Kennedy and de Gaulle in France, where France said we need our own. So a lot of this Washington Declaration, correctly so, I think, made it very clear that the US is there for South Korea. Extended deterrence is there for South Korea. You should not be pursuing your own nuclear weapons because economically and politically, it's not going to help you in many ways. But what we see is an escalation guide on the Korean Peninsula, an escalation where North Korea is continuing to build these ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, building more highly enriched uranium-based, plutonium-based nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. So the possibility of accidental conflict, especially as you said in the early part of your presentation, where North Korea has a preemptive policy, a first use policy, where if they perceived even an imminent threat, they could use their own nuclear weapons, strategic, tactical nuclear weapons, and so forth. So how do we address the issue of especially with China? And China, and we saw with the six-party talks, has a lot of leverage and brought North Korea to the table in the six-party talks. Mm-hmm. But a China now that's not willing to bring North Korea to the table. A China now that is, Xi Jinping in his recent conversation with Kim Jong-un has said, we're there for you. You mentioned the Peace and Friendship Treaty that was reestablished, reconstituted in 2021. China's there, but China's not helping with bringing North Korea to the table so that it can stop this escalation. And as we see this escalation, the possibility of stumbling into accidental conflict. How do you address that? Isn't that a concern to the people in the Republic of Korea, to the people in the region, to all people? Nuclear confrontation?
Absolutely. The way that I think we look at that is that not having any dialogue with North Korea directly and not having a clear assurance that somehow Beijing is on the team, so to speak, with helping to revive that dialogue. That's a heavy weight on the shoulders of the Biden administration right now. And I say that not so much as a critic, but as an observer. I know that there are a slate of really smart, experienced advisors on the NSC and at state that are working on this, and diplomats in the region as well. But we haven't had real momentum from this White House on trying to get. We did have the Biden-Xi G20 meeting where the North Korea issue was mentioned, but we didn't have momentum, and we don't have a loud push. And what we had with the Yoon visit was very little talk about dialogue or the need for there to be a reopening of dialogue. That was just not a headline from this summit, and there was mention of it. That we're open to denuclearization talks, but the idea of speaking openly and directly about China's role And, I remember being in Seoul at a speech that Ambassador Chris Hill gave in, I think, 2014. So we're going back a decade. And at that time, I remember sitting in the audience, and he gave this plea to the region for everyone from Tokyo to Seoul and then to Washington and to Beijing to understand that the only way forward would be for Beijing and Tokyo and Seoul to somehow find some common ground and work together toward dialogue to stave off a nuclear confrontation. Whether the different parties in those capitals like it or agree on all of it, that doesn't matter. There's no way you can solve the problem without involvement of those stakeholders. So did we see movement forward on that last week? I don't think so. I think we have to have another point on this, which I think was an interesting sort of elephant that was or wasn't in the room last week, was that almost everyone in the American national security community who's working on East Asia is spending a few hours every day looking at the China-Taiwan dynamic. And any student of the Korean Peninsula knows that there's a connection between North Korea and Taiwan. There's a historical connection between North Korea, Taiwan, Japan, pre-World War II developments, post-World War II developments, Mao's desire to take Taiwan prior to the Korean War. And we didn't really hear very much about Taiwan during the Yoon visit. It didn't really come up. That was a surprise for me, that there wasn't an initiative to push the ball forward a little bit on the question of who in the region really would stand with the United States should there be a confrontation, not just about North Korea, but about Taiwan over the coming years, because of China's increasing rhetoric about absorbing Taiwan, possibly using military force to absorb Taiwan. And I don't think that it would be out of bounds for the leader of the 10th largest economy in the world, the leader of a country that is one of the top security allies of the United States, to make mention of Taiwan. And we really didn't hear it during the Yoon visit. And I don't put that, again, I finished my comment here, that I put that weight on the Biden administration's shoulders.
But there was a comment made about peace in the Taiwan Strait.
Right.
I mean, that was
right.
Okay. Very great. Thank you, Guy. Alexander, we have a minute or two for one final question from you, and then we'll close it with our speaker, Guy Taylor. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador. Because one of the most important decisions which was made at the summit was the one to institutionalize the so-called nuclear sharing discussions or process, however you want to call them, which means that in the US government and in South Korean government, there will be officials, probably at the deputy minister level, who will be empowered to talk about these issues. So my question to you, Guy, now is whether, what's the point for the position of special envoy for North Korean peace talks? Maybe now, more importantly, is to have a special envoy for North Korean, or for the nuclear warfare planning between the two countries. And that's the official from Washington who will be basically welcomed with open arms in Seoul. It's the envoy for nuclear war planning, as opposed to an envoy for nuclear peace talks with North Korea. Who should be that person? What do you think?
I think that's a really good question. I'm not going to take the bait and throw a name out and then get emails, because I am a byline journalist in a newsroom, and that's something you put a name out, and I will write the story documenting that. Ambassador
DeTrani is my man, because he knows best from all angles.
Well, Dr. Mansourov, Guy, thank you for your question, Alexander. Dr. Mansourov asked a number of good questions, and Guy, your presentation, I just can't commend you enough for capturing the visit of Yoon Suk Yeol, President Yoon, to the United States, and the Washington Declaration. And I think you also touched on the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the need for greater clarity on some of these issues here, because the economic relationship between our ally, the Republic of Korea, and the United States is forged obviously with the Korean War and looking at the threat from the north, but also this economic relationship for the and South Korea being the 10th largest gross GDP country in the world. Hopefully they become part of the G7 and they become the G8. This is so important that we look at the economic relationship we have with the Republic of Korea, and indeed drill down on issues you mentioned, which weren't very closely or analyzed, or at least discussed during the visit, although everything else was. But to include the CHIPS and the IRA and some other related issues on that, and then again we didn't even mention Xi Jinping's conversation with President Zelensky over the past week. They spent an hour talking about, let's see if we can sort of get some resolution to this tragic war that's going on in Ukraine. So, but what a great session. What a great visit of President Yoon to the United States. I think we should all feel very, very good about it. And over to you for the last word. I want Guy Taylor to have the last word in this session here, because your presentation, but also your continuous reporting on the region, but indeed on the Korean Peninsula, is so insightful, Guy Taylor, that we want to personally thank you very much. So over to you for the last word, Guy Taylor.
Well, again, I'm honored to be here and to have a chance to push the perspective of a journalist, pulling in a lot of different factors and having a big picture focus. I want to close just shortly on things that I think, not so much an opinionated take, but observations of things I think I would like to see there be news headlines about.
Guy, we have 1 minute though.
1 minute,
to do it.
1 minute.
1 minute.
Very short. The Biden administration could benefit from throwing some kind of an economic bone to the Yoon administration, some kind of economic concession, anti-inflation act, tax breaks for South Korean companies doing business in the United States, especially in the high-tech semiconductor realm. We also need, and this is the final point, we need more bandwidth in the US administration for the North Korea issue, diplomatically, strategically, on every front, in order to make both robust strategic moves like those called for in the Washington Declaration, but also, perhaps more importantly, in pushing for a restoration and a revival of dialogue, actual diplomatic dialogue with North Korea. That's my—
Thank you, Guy Taylor. Well said. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and especially thanks to Guy Taylor with the Washington Times. Your insights and your deep review of everything that's going on is so important, so much insight. And we're very honored that you spoke for us today on the Washington Brief. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Mansourov, always bringing other points of view that help us go deeper in understanding. And Ambassador DeTrani, just always very clear why you're still directly engaged in Northeast Asia at the highest levels and with the United States. And we are so honored with your leadership here. I want to give a special thanks to Chris Dolan, president of the Washington Times. He always makes sure that this program gets coverage, and that also goes right to Korea through the Korea Times and Yonhap, and really helpful. Also, thanks to Dr. Walsh and the Universal Peace Federation, that's one of our sponsors. And I can't thank our program coordinators enough for all the background work. And we really are looking forward to a summit that's coming up in Korea very soon. And we're going to see the advancement of the US, Korea, and we hope that the Japan alliance will become much more open and solid and move on to a new history. I felt myself from the presentation of President Yoon at the Congress that it was really a vision of the future. What will happen when these relationships become solid and more open and more free? It really could cause a transition of the world towards prosperity and cooperation. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience.